Hey YouTube, Dwayne, Doozer's Models. It's a little bit different video than I usually make. We'll test it out, see how it's received, so on and so forth. So I get a few comments about the paint jobs that I do. I get quite a bit of credit and people saying, oh, you do great paint and so on and so forth. And I just want to start out by saying that I don't think I'm any better a painter than a lot of the guys out there or any of the guys out there. I do have a lot of experience with painting. Over the years, I started out as a kid with a Binks airbrush spraying t-shirts. I've painted motorcycle helmets, I've painted guitars, I've painted goalie masks, I've painted some cars, some panels on cars. I painted graphics on vinyl for cars for years that I sold and different stuff. So I have a fair bit of experience with paint, different kinds of paint, different paint methodologies and strategies and ways of doing things. But the point that I want to make today and what this video is based on is, yes, it takes some skill. Most of that skill is from just painting, and that's a general statement, not just regarding me. But the biggest thing is the patience and the process and the time and just doing it over and over and over again. And even then, your most experienced guys will tell you that with all the prep and all the strategy or whatever that, you still get failures. So it's not always on you, and I don't think I'm any better than anybody else, but I do think that I do quality paint jobs. And what I want to point out is it's the methodology, it's the time, the patience, and the process. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to just quickly show the latest paint job that I did. This is the one I'm giving to Terry too. It's going in the mail probably as early as tomorrow. So if you look at it, it's candy red, silver, black. This is on the 66 Chevelle. There's decals on there. Look real close. Here's the body. So as you can see, it's got a nice shine to it. It's not perfect. There's a little bit of texture to it, but the shine is pretty good. There's a few goobers in it. I mean, it's not perfect, but as far as model job, paint jobs, it's pretty good. But what I want to do is I want to explain to you the process and the time that went into this. And I think that's the biggest difference between those of you that are getting good results, great results, bad results. And it's the time, the patience, and the prep work. So with all that preface done, here's what I basically did. I took the raw kit and I scraped all the flash around the edges. I scraped all the high areas where the seam lines would be. And then I took 600 grit sandpaper and I sanded down all the mold lines, smoothed off all the sharp edges, and I can get technical and tell you how paint lies and different things or whatever that, but I decided not to go that route. If there's interest in that, I can do that another day. Okay, so I took, I don't know, probably half hour, 45 minutes, 600 grit sandpaper, sanded the whole thing down. Now, this one here has a couple of options for the hood scoop. So I chose this one, and I don't know if you guys have done this kit or not before, but there's some pretty large gaps that are, left when you do this. So the first step was to glue that in and to putty it and sand it and putty it and sand it. Now there's several different ways of doing that. You can use sprue goo, you can use any of the putties that are on the market, you can use super glue. I mean, there's a plethora of ways of filling those gaps, and it's a comfort level on whatever you like to use. So you fill those, you let them dry, you knock those down with the 600, and then you give the whole thing a coat of a good primer. Now I suggest, especially at this stage, that you use a sandable gap filling primer. So you can use but you can use like the store-bought stuff from Home Depot or wherever. I prefer the Tamiya. It's a little more expensive, but to me it gets real good results. You can use like Stanolres and the different, whatever you want to do, whatever you're comfortable with, whatever your price point is, you use a good quality primer. So then you take 1000 grit sandpaper and you dry sand that down to knock down all the obvious high spots and all the different things. Then you take a low pressure, I use black, you can use a dark gray, whatever you want, a primer, and I mist it, like not a black coat, not a whatever, just a very, very subtle mist. And the reason you do that is when you take a sanding stick or a block sander, something that maintains the squareness of it, you don't want to use your fingers because your fingers will follow the gaps. You want to use something that's hard, like a sanding stick or a block or something to get the block sanding effect. You take 1000 grit sandpaper and you lightly go over that black, and what that does is that shows you your blemishes, your high spots, your low spots. So anything with that you can fill. You can use a primer fill, like I'll use this stuff here, to me a primer fill. You can use another coat of primer. If it's major gaps, you can use a putty or any kind of different stuff like that. This stuff here is pretty good. Oops, almost dropped it. White putty. There's, to me, a putty. I mean, there's lots of different putty options. Again, it's whatever your comfort level is and whatever. I prefer the one that dries quick so that you can sand on it right away. Okay, so then I get to that stage. I hit it with another slightly heavier coat of primer. If the body looks smooth and everything's good, I'll take a 2000 grit sandpaper to that and I'll sand it smooth. So now my prep work and my base work is done and I'm 3-4 hours into it easily. Again, patience, consistency, so on and so forth. So at that time, and the other part that I didn't say earlier is you want to have a process in your mind before you start anything of what you want the overall look to be. So if it's a fade, it's a 3-tone, if there's decals involved, however it is, and then you back methodology it and do it. So you just kind of have to have it in your mind of where you want to be first, and then you do the steps to get there. So with this particular one, at this point I took my House of Color Orion Silver and I shot the whole car with silver. Got a nice even finish. It showed me if there was any blemishes, anything that needed more attention, and I got to where that was. At that point, I take 2000 grit sandpaper, wet sand all of the silver, hopefully not breaking through the silver. If you can manage to do that without breaking through, then you can move forward. If you break through, then you got to shoot it with a little bit more silver, get a little bit of buildup on it, and get it all done. The one thing I forgot to say is because of the processes that go, it's advantageous to take a scriber and deepen your panel lines. For scribing, I use primarily this. It's an expensive tool, but it's a great tool. Some people use the back side of a number 11 blade. Some people use other scribers. Again, whatever your comfort level is. So now I've got a silver car that I'm quite happy with and sanded down and smooth and everything's good. So at that time, I take some thin masking tape, and again, whatever masking tape you like. Some people use the paper stuff, some people use fine line, sort of a plastic stuff. For this very thin type, I use actual pinstriping from Automotive. I don't have any here, but I can show it another time. So I laid out my silver lines. So basically all I did is took the tape, measured it closely. I got a micrometer that I use. You label it off. I did the side silver. I went back and forth on whether I wanted to extend it straight across or whether I wanted to go with the look that I went with here. So I've got the silver all the way around. There is a little bit of red if you look close, a little bit of red, a little bit of silver, a little bit of black, and then the hood was done as per. So now I laid that all out, at which time I hit it with House of Color Candy Red. So that's over the silver base for the candy red part. So at this point, my silver's taped off and I've got red. Now there's some red bled off there and on the thing, but I didn't care about that because at the end of the day, I was going to cover it with black. So I got the red done, I got the silver done, and I've got it there. So at that point, I let it sit for probably a day. House of Color actually dries within an hour or two, so you could work with it right away, but I chose to give it a day or two to really set up. Because you're masking, you want to let it set up. If you put too heavy a mask on it, too sticky a mask, and you rip it the wrong way and pull it, you could pull your paint off, which I learned with Pappies. That's a whole nother story. So at that point, I taped off all the red, and I took out my House of Color black and I shot it with black. So I let that sit. I prefer to take the mask off about an hour or two after I've sprayed most paints, so they're still a little bit sticky, but yet hard enough to pull the paint off and not wreck. When you're pulling your mask off, you always pull away from the color that you don't want to peel off. So you're peeling it into it so that if it's not as abrasive to peel off the hard line, if that makes any sense. Hopefully it does to you. So now I've got my three base colors. I've got my silver, my red, and my black. So at this time, I want to smooth everything out and kind of blend in the lines a little bit. So I take a really high grit sandpaper, probably around a 5000 or something like that, and I wet sand it, and I very, very lightly knock off those edges. So at this point, I'm sanding on these areas here, trying to level those out without cutting into the color. So it's very delicate, very careful at that point. You do a little circular motion and you try, watch very carefully what you're doing, and you don't cut into your things and you get it there. So once you get it to that point where it's a little bit smooth, the paint is all down showing, I shoot it with a coat of clear coat. I let that sit for 2 to 3 days, throw it in the incubator if I want to rush it. I get that done. So then I take 2000 grit wet sand and I sand the whole body. Try to get it as smooth as I can. I feel these lines here till I can't feel them anymore, or I can't feel them with my nail, so they're nice and smooth. I got my base coat of clear on, everything's good. So I sand that off, and then I let it sit for a little bit, and then I masked off the chrome for the windshield wipers, that and the door handles. If you look closely, I drilled out the door handles, a little bit of extra detail. So I masked all that off, and I spray it with my clear, or my chrome, I'm sorry, that I utilize. And this is the, I don't know if you can say it. It's, there you go, Despaia chrome. It's the best chrome that I've used. I use All-Clad sometimes. I use some of the other brands of chrome. I've used the Molotow replacement through the airbrush. Whatever you're comfortable with. To me, that's the best results, but again, whatever you're happy with, whatever you like to do. So at that point, I again laid a layer of clear coat on it. So I put a layer of clear, I let that set 2 or 3 days. I sand that down with 2000 grit sandpaper again, try to smooth it out. At this time, I applied the decals. So decals, whatever, if you're Canadian. So if you look there, there's Super Sport decals on that one, and on the hood, I've got the Chevy there, and then on the hood scoop, I can't really, there's a, can't get it to read. It's 427 or whatever that decal is, and I chrome up the pins and I get all that ready. So then I again lay a nice clear coat mist. Now when you're going over decals, you don't want to go heavy over the decal first, because it will move the decal. If you're using a really hot clear, it'll melt the decal. It's a really careful process, so you really do like a mist coat. You just barely mist over it. You let it sit for 5 or 10 minutes. You mist over it a little heavier. You let it sit for 5 or 10 minutes. Then you do a mist coat over your whole body, a tack coat, a mist coat, whatever you want to call it. Then you go a little bit heavier, and then you do your final wet coat, and you let it set. Sometimes in that last wet coat, I'll add a touch of leveling thinner or reducer. Just thin it out a little bit, help it self-level and get that final smooth finish. So then I let that sit for 4 or 5 days, throw it in the incubator, and depending on how that comes out, if it's a little bit orange peeled, if you've got some boogers in there, or if it's a little bit rougher, you're going to want to sand it out with a 4000 or a 5000, somewhere in there. Again, gently working with it till you get it to the level of smooth that you want. From that point, you can polish it out. You can use like the Tamiya compound polisher. And again, depending on how rough it is, you may want to use the scratch and filler 3-stage polisher, 1-stage polisher, 2, whatever it needs. Sometimes I get that final finish so good that I don't have to polish it, but it's pretty rare. So you want to minimize the sanding because the polishing process for me is the harder part. It's hard to bring it back to that original luster through polishing, but some guys can do it, and I can tend to get it pretty good. So once you get it polished, smooth, finished to where you're happy with it, for this particular one, I took just this cheap acrylic paint from the dollar store, and I painted the insides black. You can paint them gray or whatever you want, but I like to do them black. It just sort of finishes it all off. It smooths everything out. And the last and final step is a wax. Some people use Maguire's. I like this gravity wax. It works quite nice. And basically it's same as you would wax your car. You take a little bit of the wax, you buff it on, you rub it around, you take a micro cloth or a really smooth cloth, soft cloth, whatever it is. You polish it around, you let it sit, you wipe it off, and you're done. So all told, I'm probably into this particular car, I would say 10, maybe 20 man hours and 3 weeks. You know, lots of time sitting, lots of time curing, lots of time whatever. So it's a process. It takes patience, but it's not a matter of not being a good painter or being a bad painter or whatever. It's knowing the steps, having the patience to take the time, and anybody can do this. And even the guys that are really good still have failures. So don't beat yourself up if something does happen. I forgot to mention, I use soap and water to wash it in between stages. I wear gloves whenever possible, try to keep the waxes in your hand. Any airborne silicones, any glues, any contaminants, anything that gets on there could potentially cause you a reaction. So you want to minimize that. You want to minimize contact with the model. You want to minimize handling as best you can, but most steps you're sanding it in anyways. I'm starting to ramble. I don't mean to do that. I guess my point and the part I want to hit home is don't ever say, oh, I wish I could paint that good. You can paint that good if you have the patience and you go through the steps and you use quality materials. Anybody can get a show quality paint job. I do it through airbrushing and whatever that. As Pappy says, you can get the same effects through rattle cans. You can get them different qualities of paint. It's all relevant in how you like to work, the products that you like to do, that you can fit within your budget, and so on. But if you have the patience and you go through the steps and you take the time, anybody can do show quality paint jobs. That's my point. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope it was of value to somebody. Build on, guys. Thanks for watching. Yeah, this is a long one.